All right. In the interest of time, I'm going to jump in because there's lots to cover. I want to welcome everybody here today. It's really exciting to have you all here for our live stream series, which is where we aim to connect and inspire each other around river-related issues and ideas. My name is Stacy Leonard. I'm the events manager here at Connecticut River Conservancy. So thanks again for being here. Today's episode is an act of Congress, new legislation to protect our watershed. We've created this episode in honor of Earth Day, as we wanted to celebrate the current acts of Congress that are being developed to assist in protecting our great river, to understand how these bills came to be and what they will do to protect our watershed. We're excited to be joined by three special guests: Markelle Smith, who leads up the Connecticut River Watershed Partnership, a group that you may know formerly as the Friends of Conte, speaking with Jeremy Bratt, a consultant on the project, and they will both talk about the Connecticut River Watershed Partnership Act, CRWPA. Then we'll hear from Christopher Curtis, who's the Vice President of the Deerfield River Watershed Association, talking about the Deerfield River Wild and Scenic River Study and its implications. Bless you. And our own river steward in Vermont, Kathy Urffer, will tie all of this together for us. Before we go on, just those usual housekeeping details. We really want your questions and encourage you to put them in the chat for now. And at the end, we've saved some time for that, answering as many questions as we can. And hopefully we have a somewhat small group, we can have a little discussion. We are recording the episode and we will post it on our YouTube channel, where you can also see past recordings of other live streams. And I'll send out an email later today with all of this information, the recording, and some other resources for you to stay connected with our work. So to start us off, I'm going to turn it over to Kathy, who can give us some more context, and then we'll hear from our guests. So again, welcome everybody, and see you at the Q&A.
Awesome. Thanks, Stacy. Hello, everybody. So as we were planning our live streams for this season, we normally do these in the winter. Some of these bills were on my mind, and also, we were thinking about Earth Day. And so this to us seemed like a good tie-in, because the idea of Earth Day is now an international action, but really started as a national action. So in honor of Earth Day, just a little bit of a walk through its history before we dig into some of the things that are on the table now. So if you were born after the 70s, right, like we are slowly losing the history of like how bad it was. So I wanted to provide some bleak images here.
How bad it really was.
To set the context for, why Earth Day happened the way it did. And so a couple pictures here from the 60s and 70s. The one on the left, that's June 1973. Those are some kids that are fishing on the Back River in Baltimore, Maine, next to the sewage treatment plant. And you can see there is sewage in that water. Maybe that makes the fishing good. It's probably not that healthy for those kids. The image on the top is the boom that was finally put in place. This is holding back oil from a massive spill on the San Juan River. And this oil traveled for 200 miles before they were able to boom it and start to clean it up. The lower right, I literally remember this being a little girl in Arizona, right? This is your typical garbage dump where everyone is taking their garbage and then it is burning. We obviously don't do that anymore. And then in the center is an image of a huge, the Santa Barbara oil spill, which in some ways was maybe a precipitating factor that lit the match to get Earth Day started. Earth Day, if you can go to the next slide. Thanks, Alex. So Earth Day, was started by members of Congress, but it was not a law. It was actually started by Gaylord Nelson. And so the first Earth Day was observed April 22nd, 1970. There were 20 million people nationwide. That was 10% of the US population attended events on that first Earth Earth Day. And it started really with Senator Gaylord Nelson, who was a Democrat from Wisconsin, who engaged Representative Pete McCloskey, who was a Republican from California, who was dealing with that 1969 oil spill off Santa Barbara. And I think in some ways that was one of the precipitating events, in addition to the Cuyahoga River being on fire and sewage, that really kind of lit the match for them, where they decided like something needs to be done about this. And simultaneously, we had the anti-war movement going on in Vietnam. So they wanted to use the energy of the anti-war movement to start to educate the public about air and water pollution. So Senator Nelson announced this idea for teach-ins on college campuses, and then they recruited this guy, the picture in the middle is Dennis Hayes, to organize campus teach-ins. They chose April 22nd because it was a weekday that fell between spring break and final exams, and they figured that way they would get the most college students engaged in the process. And Dennis, I think, dropped out of Harvard Kennedy School to do this. And then he built a team of 85 staff and continued to kind of move Earth Day forward year after year. So interestingly, Earth Day was not started by an act of Congress. It was started by radical people who were pissed off, who decided to go out on their own. And it was really a protest. It was really an act of protest and education, right? To cause some movement in the country. But as a result of Earth Day, by the end of 1970, this effort resulted in the creation of multiple really important pieces of federal legislation. So it established the groundwork to develop the United States Environmental Protection Agency. During those few years, we had the passage of the National Environmental Education Act, the Occupational Safety and Health Act, the Clean Air Act. Those all occurred in 1970. And then 2 years later, 1972, we had the passage of the Clean Water Act. And since then, many other bills. One of the interesting things about the Representative McCloskey, he actually was a co-author of the 1973 Endangered Species Act. So a whole bunch of really important federal legislation came out of this kind of really grassroots effort. I will pass it on now to Markelle. I wanted to stage it this way because we have some federal legislation that is going to be beneficial to our watershed, and we wanted to be able to do a deep dive in this as this legislation moves forward, to activate our members and the community members to try to help push for this legislation to pass. So with that, take it over, Markelle and Jeremy.
Thanks so much, Kathy. Thank you to Connecticut River Conservancy for hosting this event. This is great to have an opportunity to talk with you a little bit about what we have going on in the watershed in terms of legislation. First, I'm going to sort of give the bigger picture here. Connecticut River Conservancy is a longtime and an original founding member of the Friends of Conte, which is a regional conservation partnership and based in the Connecticut River Watershed. And we have a lot of different organizations who are part of the Friends of Conte. Recently, the Friends of Conte was excited. We had an opportunity to host a staff person for the first time, and I'm serving in that role currently as director of the Connecticut River Watershed Partnership. So we have changed our name from Friends of Conte to the Connecticut River Watershed Partnership. It's a mouthful, not a great acronym. We tried for better, but this was sort of the most accurately descriptive name we could come up with. But anyway, this group has been in existence for a while, and there's a lot of us involved. It's a group of groups, really, a regional conservation partnership working together on behalf of the watershed to get good work done. Next slide, please. For those of you who are familiar, I think many of you are, I bet, the Conte Refuge, named after Silvio O. Conte, who's actually a Republican from Pittsfield, Massachusetts. The Conte Refuge was formed in 1997. It's unique. It's the only multi-state watershed-based refuge in the entire National Wildlife Refuge System. So it covers our watershed, the Connecticut River Watershed. So basically, this is the longest river in New England. It's the largest watershed, 7.2 million acres. And what's really great about this, the watershed has received really national attention due to the fact that we have so many people and so many intact forests and also freshwater resources in our watershed. So we really have an opportunity to showcase natural communities and human communities living side by side here in a way that is really unique and special. The Conte Refuge is comprised of, on this map, you can see these orange blobs. There's 23 divisions of land. And so that totals about 46,000 acres now owned and managed by the refuge. And it really, what's unique about this is also it was really formed with the spirit of partnerships in mind. So really everybody knew that this refuge is obviously not going to be owned and managed entirely by Fish and Wildlife Service, but really this is a group of partners working in a landscape, a watershed together on behalf of conservation. And it's really been, since it was formed and established, it's really been quite successful in terms of really convening partners around a shared vision for the watershed. Next slide. So this picture is old, and I don't know exactly how old, but you all might recognize some of the people in the photo. This, I think, is at the Cabela's store in Hartford, Connecticut, where they have a Conte corner. But the Friends of Conte was established back in 2005. So the Friends have been around for a long time. And really, right now, we're in the midst of kind of expanding our partnership to incorporate more interests, more diverse interests. But right now have around over 75, I would say, entities, organizations, and individuals working together in the watershed. And we really just come together around, we convene, we come together around shared priorities. We have a lot of tools that we use to sort of highlight projects that are happening in partnership throughout the watershed. This particular map that you see here is one that showcases a variety of aquatic connectivity projects that are going on. So each year, the Friends of Conte, now the Connecticut River Watershed Partnership, prepares a lookbook, and that lookbook highlights various project opportunities, and it's a way to go to the delegation, to Congress, and say, you know what, if we were to receive funding, this is all the great work we could do. And we have I think this year's lookbook will probably have around $37 million worth of land acquisition projects and about $22 million worth of restoration projects, which is exciting. And we know that's only a small subset of all that's going on here. Next slide, please. And this is wordy, so I won't get into it too much, but over time, these are the things that the Friends of Conte have worked on. We've been particularly successful in getting land and water conservation appropriations to the Conte Refuge, which are then shared with partners to get more land conserved in the watershed. There's also been some great work around designation of the river as the first and only national blueway in the country. We also did a bunch of work with this great LWCF coalition to get authorization and full funding of land and water conservation funds through the Great American Outdoors Act. Next slide, please. So this is our current effort, and this is why we're here to talk with you today a little bit more about the Connecticut River Watershed Partnership Act. So when I think it was a couple of years ago now, we were sort of talking with other partners and feeling like, wait a second, the Delaware River has this awesome federal legislation. The Chesapeake has great federal legislation. We're missing that in our very large watershed in New England, and really felt like, wait a sec, maybe we could do something similar for our watershed. And so In that spirit, we drafted legislation, and this is new to me. This is not my background, which is why Jeremy is with me today on the call, and he's been great, as well as many of the groups who are part of the partnership have a lot of policy expertise and have been hugely helpful in getting this to move forward. But basically what we did is drafted legislation, and we really closely modeled it on the Delaware River Basin Conservation Act. Basically the model here is to create a program that would be housed in U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And the idea would be to get a bunch of extra funding to do this great work, the conservation, restoration, education, and recreation that were all these projects that we've been working on throughout the watershed, to get more funding and to be able to leverage additional private funding through that public funding, and to really facilitate more coordination with all of the work that's being done by nonprofits, by state agencies, by federal agencies across the watershed. What we've also found is this has been a great way to recruit diverse sort of partners, people and individuals and organizations that haven't been as involved, but that are very interested in the conservation work that we see as really valuable right now, especially with climate change and all the impacts we've been experiencing up and down the watershed with increased flooding, especially that we saw this past summer, and ways that we're all connected that we might not have had envisioned before. Rivers connect us, and for sure the Connecticut River does that. So this is an attempt really to bring additional resources to partners working in the watershed. And there's a whole bunch of well, you can actually access the bill language. It's online, and I'll let Jeremy talk a little bit more about that. But next slide, please. This is the group of organizations who have signed on in support of the Connecticut River Watershed Partnership Act. And the act has been introduced in both the House and the Senate. In the Senate, our sponsor is Senator Jeanne Shaheen in New Hampshire, and in the House, our sponsor is Rep. Jim McGovern in Massachusetts. And so far, we have pretty much the entire delegation for the Connecticut River Watershed signed on as co-sponsors, with the exception of Senator Sanders in Vermont, and then Rep. DeLauro in Connecticut, and she's chairs appropriations, so is not going to likely sign on as co-sponsor, but we know she's supportive. Next slide, please. So I'm going to hand it over to Jeremy to talk a little bit more about some of the details of the process of getting this, where we go from here, kind of, and where things stand right now.
Yeah, thanks so much, Markelle. And it's a pleasure to be connected with everyone. My name is Jeremy Bratt, and I'm a consultant and a lobbyist in Washington, D.C., where we're enjoying we get about 10 to 14 days of spring every year before it turns into summer for 3 months. And so we're enjoying one of those spring days. And I've been really pleased to work with Markelle and the coalition on this legislation. If you saw that slide she had up 1 or 2 slides ago that showed that long list in small font of all the groups that are supportive of this bill, we've got a great collection of some national organizations, some New England-wide or region-wide organizations, some individual state chapters, and then even some really small local land trusts and local community groups. And everybody's sort of coming together because they see that the health and the restoration of the whole watershed is going to be for the benefit of the entire region, and that's terrific to see. So we have this legislation. It's been introduced in both the House and the Senate. That was the first hurdle, and so we were really pleased to get Senator Shaheen and Congressman McGovern introduce it. They introduced identical versions in the House and the Senate. The way you show support or you demonstrate support for legislation in Congress is you go out and you get other members of Congress to agree to support your legislation. They become co-sponsors of it. And so we have a good list of co-sponsors in both the House and the Senate. Like Markelle said, just about every member of Congress or senator whose district or whose state touches the river and the watershed is on board. Senator Sanders, we just had a conversation with his staff yesterday, in fact. And they were really interested to learn more about the bill and said they would run it up the chain to the boss, but they didn't anticipate a lot of problems. After a bill's introduced, it gets referred to different committees in the House and the Senate based on what its topic is. You know, education bills go to a certain committee, and agriculture bills go to a certain committee. This one was referred in the Senate to the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, and it was referred in the House of Representatives to two committees, one the House Natural Resources Committee and the other on Transportation and Infrastructure. Our next steps are, we are hoping that both the Senate and the House committees will hold hearings on the bill. Probably not just on our bill. They'll usually hold hearings on 3 or 4 bills at a time where they say, okay, we've got this legislation before us. This is what it would accomplish. Let's have some witnesses come in and talk about it. Perhaps some of the folks on this call will end up submitting testimony or coming in to speak before the committees on it. And it gives members of Congress and senators a chance to ask questions about the legislation. What is this trying to accomplish, et cetera. Like Markelle said, this has been modeled after really successful legislation for other watersheds in the past, for the Delaware River. The Chesapeake Bay actually has a longstanding program like this. And so we don't think and it's non-regulatory in nature. So we don't think it's going to be particularly contentious. After that, the next step after that hearing would be for members of Congress in those committees to hold a vote on whether we want to send this bill out of our committee and send it to the House and the Senate floor. Now, of course, we know this is a long process. Thousands of bills get introduced every year. Not all of them get markups or voted on in their committees. Even fewer still get voted on the House and the Senate floors. But our plan is to kind of get through the committee process and then let everyone know that because we've got this big list of supporters, because we've got this big list of co-sponsors, all these organizations that are endorsing it, and because this is really uncontroversial, broadly supported legislation, we'll try to get it attached in a package that's already moving through Congress. And when somebody says, okay, send me the 25 least controversial bills that you've got out of your committee, that we will be one of them and that will be in the mix. We're not under any illusions necessarily that it's going to happen quickly, but we're doing everything we can to make sure that we have the right folks in Congress who are aware of the legislation, who understand that it's really broadly supported, and that we've got a really strong base of backers, both organizationally and in Congress. So that's our game plan to try to get this over the finish line, and I'm happy to answer any questions during the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Next up, we have Chris Curtis from Deerfield River Watershed.
Hi, everybody. I'm Chris Curtis, and I'm Vice President of the Deerfield River Watershed Association. We're an all-volunteer nonprofit organization that works to monitor and care for the watershed. And my background is I was formerly Chief Planner at Pioneer Valley Planning Commission, and have worked on wild and scenic rivers previously. I led the efforts to get the Westfield River designated as the first wild and scenic river in Massachusetts. So our initiative here began, I guess, in 2022. We've been working to try to find ways to achieve wild and scenic designation for the Deerfield River. And next slide. We feel like the Deerfield River has really exceptional qualities that make it well qualified for National Wild and Scenic River designation. It's a unique recreational and natural resource that runs for 76 miles from southern Vermont through northwestern Massachusetts. It goes through the Green Mountain National Forest and the Berkshire Hills and traverses through many historic hill towns, and has a number of free-flowing tributaries. Next slide. And there were a number of segments that have been identified on the National Rivers Inventory as having outstandingly remarkable values for National Wild and Scenic designation. That's a term that is used in the legislation for wild and scenic and we have to try to demonstrate that we have these outstandingly remarkable values. So some of the things that we feel like make the river qualified are that we have a number of tributaries to the main stem of the Deerfield, such as the Cold River, the Bog, and the Gulf Brooks that are completely free-flowing rivers without dams. The main stem itself has some number of dams on it, but there are segments of the river that would still qualify because they are essentially free-flowing between the dams. Next slide. And the main stem of the river has outstanding whitewater and boating opportunities, perhaps really the best in Massachusetts, with rapids from class 2 to 4, very heavily used in the summertime. Next slide. And it's also really an outstanding trout fishery. Fishermen say it's some of the best dry fly fishing for wild trout anywhere in the East. Next slide. And we have the historic Mohawk Mohican Trail, that Mohican Mohawk Trail rather, that runs along the river through many communities and was originally a ancient Native American travel route. So great recreational resource there. Next. And we have a lot of history along the river. The river traverses through many New England villages that have historic significance, including Shelburne Falls, which is shown here with the Bridge of Flowers, historic Deerfield. There's an image of the covered bridge at Green River in Vermont. So many historic places along the river. Next. So for those reasons, we feel like the river qualifies. So the process for getting a river designated is fairly long and complex. It often takes many years and sometimes even decades to do. The steps basically are that communities along the river first have to demonstrate that there is support for the concept and for a feasibility study. And then Congress passes legislation authorizing a feasibility study and a stewardship plan to be developed for the river. The National Park Service plays a role. They fund and conduct the study to determine if the river is eligible and feasible for designation, and that it's locally desirable for it to become designated. We set up a steering committee that has representatives from local interests that assist in doing the feasibility study. And then once that study's done, every community in the watershed has the opportunity to adopt the locally developed watershed stewardship plan and to consider and vote on whether or not they would like to seek formal designation of the river as a partnership wild and scenic river. And then lastly, Congress has to vote a second time to actually designate the river as a wild and scenic river. Next. So we've begun this process back in 2022. We've been at it a couple of years now. We've been working to engage the communities in our watershed in both Massachusetts and Vermont. And to date, we've contacted every community in the watershed, and we've secured letters of support from 18 communities in the watershed, 11 in Massachusetts and 7 in Vermont, in support of the idea of wild and scenic for the Deerfield River. Next slide. So this slide, hopefully you can see this, shows the communities that have already stated their support for the designation, and you can see the list for both Vermont and Massachusetts here. And so far, we've had no communities in opposition to this concept. Next slide. In addition to the communities, we've reached out to regional and state organizations, and there are 11 of those in both Massachusetts and Vermont that have expressed formal support for the designation. Again, you can see the list here. I'm not going to read the whole group. And also, we're starting to reach out to businesses like the Whitewater Boating industry along the river to get their support as well. Next slide. We have support for our legislation from the entire Western Massachusetts congressional delegation and the entire Vermont congressional delegation. I'll talk a little bit more in detail about the bill that we've put together, but the lead on our bill has been Congressman McGovern and Senator Markey, with again support from the rest of the delegation. Next slide. So there are benefits to the towns from this designation, and primarily those are that it promotes tourism and economic development in the community, but there are also strong potential for getting federal technical and financial assistance to do projects to enhance and to protect the river. Some studies have shown that there's a direct economic benefit to communities because it does improve opportunities for a recreational tourist destination. Next slide. So we're trying to achieve what's called partnership wild and scenic river status, and what a partnership river is one that flows predominantly through private, municipal, or state lands, and generally doesn't have federal or much federal land ownership involved with it. And those partnership rivers are administered by the Secretary of the Interior through the National Park Service, kind of in cooperation with local entities. And communities that have partnership rivers usually collaborate with the National Park Service on a protection plan. There are 15 of these partnership rivers so far in the Northeast United States, including the Westfield River in Massachusetts. Next slide. So one of the benefits to having a partnership river is that there's federal funding that comes with that. And typically the amount per year is about $220,000 per year. And that gets used for projects identified by the local committee, Wild and Scenic Committee. And there's some examples shown here of what types of projects that have been funded under this program in the past. Things like canoe and boat access and trail improvements, and other things like water quality analysis and stream surveys are also eligible. So lots of opportunities to do good work in the watershed. Next slide. One of the things that wild and scenic designation and partnership rivers don't do is put land under federal control or require public access to private land or force any changes to local land use decision-making decisions or create new federal regulations for the river. So that's also, an important point that we try to make to communities, that, this isn't something that's going to give us a huge new federal presence in the watershed. It still becomes a river that's primarily managed locally through local bylaws and local initiatives. Next slide. There is the first step in supporting river designation is the development and adoption of a watershed management plan, and that has voluntary recommendations that are intended to enhance and protect the river and its water quality. But there's no financial commitment that is required from communities to do this. The only commitment that we are looking for is to have each community designate a representative to serve on an advisory committee that would help to manage the study and the stewardship plan, and ultimately the river's protection. Next slide. And another topic that a question that gets asked a lot about wild and scenic is, there's a lot of dams on the Deerfield River. Doesn't that disqualify it from being a wild and scenic river? And the answer to that is really no, because there are free-flowing tributaries to the river. And as I mentioned earlier, there's different segments of the river really essentially in between the dams that are free flowing and don't have impoundments on them. So those segments can also qualify for wild and scenic designation. So for example, the segment in Massachusetts that's most heavily used for rafting and inner tubing in the area around Zor Gap it would be potentially eligible. Next slide. So in terms of legislation, where we are in the process is that we've had our study bill introduced with Congressman McGovern and Senator Markey leading that effort twice now in Congress. And the second time that it's been introduced, we were successful on the Senate side in moving it through the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. It got marked up and reported out of that committee, which was a big step. And very positive for the bill, and very difficult sometimes to get that to happen. On the House side, unfortunately, we haven't had really any progress in getting the bill through committee. And I think that's in part because there's a fair amount of dysfunction on the House side. Generally, things are not really moving there. So we've been trying to anticipate the possibility that our study bill might take a really long time to get through Congress, and potentially might not get through at all. So what is our alternative game plan? And what we've come up with is essentially there's a mechanism to use the congressional delegation's support to ask the National Park Service to fund what's called a reconnaissance study of the river. And a reconnaissance study is kind of like a mini feasibility study. It's not funded at the same level, but it gives us a starting point for determining eligibility and finding out whether or not the river has segments that qualify for designation. So we asked our congressional delegation to help with that, and with, again, the help of McGovern and Markey and the entire really Vermont, Massachusetts delegation, a request was made and was approved just recently by the National Park Service to get that reconnaissance study funded. And we now anticipate that that will begin work in October of this year. So what we're trying to do is to kind of package together some additional resources and perhaps fund the entire feasibility study ourselves, so that we don't really have to wait years and years for Congress to act on the feasibility study. And what we're trying to do is look at some other funding resources. One is the Woodlands Partnership grant, which happens to be the Woodlands Partnership covers most of the Massachusetts part of our watershed, and they have a grant program that provides funding for activities which we would qualify for. So we intend to apply for that this year. And we've also done a fairly large amount of fundraising ourselves through the Deerfield River Watershed Association, and have raised a substantial amount of money that we may be able to help self-fund the study to some degree as well. So our game plan is to keep working with Congress and try to see if we can't get the feasibility study funded that way, but to have a alternative kind of backup plan and hopefully move our study along regardless of whether Congress acts or not on the study bill. The other thing I guess I would mention is that we've been trying to figure out a way to package our study bill with other similar study bills from wild and scenic rivers across the country, and hope that by packaging the bills together, there might be a better chance of getting those through Congress, especially if we can find a couple of rivers that are in Republican districts that might be supportive of these types of things. So we're trying a couple of different ways to attack this issue, and hopefully we will be successful in one or the other of them. But that is where we stand as of today.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Markelle, Jeremy, and Chris for sharing all of that information and so much time and effort that none of us are so aware of that goes on behind the scenes. So really appreciate your leadership on it and all of these. So it's time for us to open up to Q&A, and I don't see any questions in the chat. So if folks want to turn on their cameras and join us in conversation, that would be great. I have a question that just to maybe help kick it off. Since you are presenting, Chris, you mentioned partnering with other wild and scenic hopefuls. Is there a connection or reciprocal relationship with the Watershed Partnership Act and wild and scenics? Like, would getting one help the other and vice versa? Or are they very separate entities? And maybe a part B of that is, what's the obstacle? Is it just appropriating funding? Is that the only reason you'd get a no? It seems like all when
Well, I guess I'll start. I don't know the complete answer to your first question, but I think we're working with a national organization, the Wild and Scenic Rivers Coalition, to try to package our bills together. And because the bills are fairly similar in intent, I think they were there's 5 of them that they have put together at this point in a package. And I guess my general sense is that probably the more rivers that we had in that package, the better. But I'd have to defer to the leadership on that. As far as obstacles to moving these things forward, it's a political issue. And I think, unfortunately, we have a relatively dysfunctional Congress at this point, and there aren't a lot of bills going through on anything. So we struggle with that, and it's really difficult to get environmental bills, particularly through this Congress, given the makeup of the Congress. So I think we're trying to get bipartisan support for bills. Unfortunately, we have mostly Democrats in our watershed, but that's why we're trying to kind of merge some of these bills together where there might be some Republican support for other rivers.
Great. It looks like Jeremy would like to add something.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Chris has had to say. We have had similar challenges in trying to identify Republicans who could be supportive, especially in the House, where Republicans are in control and hold all the gavels. One approach we have taken is to emphasize the Connecticut River's importance to the Long Island Sound. Something like 70% of the fresh water that enters the Sound comes from the Connecticut River. And when Markelle and I have had meetings, she's sometimes shown staffers this really sort of dramatic photo of sediment coming out of the river into the Sound after, I think it was Hurricane Irene, Markelle or Sandy, one of them. And it just really sort of graphically demonstrates how the health of the river and the health of the Sound are very related. And so there's a number of New York State Republicans in Congress who come from districts that abut the Sound and for whom, fishing and sportsmen and stuff are really important. And so we've gone to them to try to make the argument that, hey, if you care about the Sound, you should care about the river that feeds the Sound. And they've all heard us out and listened politely and nod, but so far those efforts haven't borne fruit. But yeah, I think in answer to your original question, Stacey, there is a sort of reluctance on the part of Republicans in the House and some in the Senate to kind of create new federal partnerships, even if they're non-regulatory, even if there's not necessarily money automatically attached to those partnerships. There's still a reluctance to sort of create additional sort of federal structures, and so that's a challenge that we're working to overcome.
One thing just to add, in terms of like a strategy around how to get this, the Connecticut River Watershed Partnership Act moving, you know, we've been talking with some partners on this Hudson River Act that's been in the works. And that's a similar legislation to ours that would be, you know, watershed-based legislation, and strategizing around, like, could we get these to move together? And what would that package look like? And how could we attach this maybe to something else that's moving, you know, with the assumption that it isn't as controversial? Maybe we could kind of get it attached to something that is going. So anyway, that all of that has been kind of great strategizing with partners. You know, it's Scenic Hudson that was really kind of leading the Hudson River Act. And so we met with them, and their former executive director, Andy Bicking, is now with Connecticut Forests and Parks. So he's in our watershed now. So now we've been talking with him a little bit to think through, like, okay, like, what's our strategy to get this moving? And we do have some people here working in our watershed who were really instrumental in passage of Chesapeake Wild, and so have some really great advice on how to move this. But of course, every Congress is unique, and we're facing our own challenges here. But I do think that bipartisan, we have no Republicans in the delegation, so how we can kind of get a Republican co-sponsor for our bill is critical. We've tried in Maine. There's a small part, as you all know, the watershed has this very tiny part of it that is in Maine, and not enough to entice Senator Collins to sign on as co-sponsor. So that was our original hope. But anyway, yeah, just wanted to add those thoughts. Thanks for the question, Stacy.
Sure. Kathy, do you want to ask yours out loud?
Sure. I was wondering, you know, if there's anything like what would be useful for members of the public if they want to try to help either one of these efforts? Like, is there any action item that would be helpful?
Yeah, it's a great question. I am happy to drop in the chat a list of the current co-sponsors that we have in the House and the Senate. And if you are in a state or a district where you look at it and you say, hey, my member of Congress isn't listed here, it would be great for you to pick up the phone or shoot an email and say, hey, you should co-sponsor this legislation. And I'll include the bill numbers and such. With the caveat that I think in the Senate, we have everybody except for Senator Sanders, and we talked to his office yesterday. And in the House, Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro from Connecticut is very supportive of the legislation, but she's also the top-ranking Democrat on the Appropriations Committee that funds the federal government. And so she typically doesn't join as a supporter of bills to sort of create new federal programs, since she's the one who will have to turn around and fund them. And so sort of to avoid conflicts, she often doesn't co-sponsor, but that shouldn't be read as any sort of kind of lack of support on her part. But I'll drop that info into the chat.
Thanks. Anybody on the
guess
line
on
want to ask a question? Oh, sorry, Chris, follow.
Well, I just wanted to respond on the Deerfield River legislation to the same question. We do already have our entire delegation in support and co-sponsoring the legislation at this point, but it's certainly always helpful for constituents to contact their representatives and let them know that they're supportive and interested in this bill. It might bump it up a little bit higher on the priority list. So those kind of calls or letters are always welcome. The other thing I would say is that if you're in a community along the Deerfield River watershed, please contact your select board and let them know as well that you're supportive, because we are actively campaigning to get support from select boards at this point for the legislation and for the study.
Were there any towns that were not in your list that you're still trying to get, or you mentioned you have all the towns, I think. Is that right?
No, actually there are 4 towns that we have not gotten signed on yet in Massachusetts, and those are Heath, Hawley, Florida, and Leiden. So if anybody out there is in any of those communities, again, connecting with your select board would be great.
For the Watershed Partnership Act, the other way that could, you know, if you're thinking about this sort of sign-on letter, we've recruited a lot of organizations who have signed on in support, but we're also interested in having additional supporters. So if you see that if there's a group you're a part of that that it hasn't signed on in support, that would be really helpful. Or even really non-traditional kind of interests too, like business interests and recreation like interests up and down the watershed. We've really tried to cast a wide net here and have gotten a lot of feedback from different groups on the draft legislation, but we really, the more the merrier here. We really want to demonstrate a lot of support for this and show that it really is, it's really a united front of us who are interested in seeing this go.
Great.
Maybe another question sort of on what you're saying, Markelle, is whether you've reached out to the backcountry hunters and anglers as a constituent that might help with it. Yeah.
Yep, we have.
Here's a question from Marie. Can someone provide information on what the recon study covers? Can parts be done by other entities? Is there potential funding through Long Island Sound Futures Fund? Is that what the F is?
Yes, it is.
Hi, Marie. We could
Hi.
definitely use your support up in Vermont for the recon study, and I'll probably be in touch with you about that. We have a small amount of funding from the National Park Service, and as I mentioned, we're looking at other grant opportunities. So we would love to know about any grant opportunities that you see in Vermont that might make sense. The Long Island Sound grants, it doesn't feel to me from reading the RFP that we would qualify there, but I'd be happy to know that maybe I'm wrong about that.
Different pots cover different things, so it'd be interesting to look into it further. Thanks.
And Chris and Maria, I'm glad to help in those conversations or noodle through that thought process if it seems useful for me to engage too. Similarly, Markelle, when you were talking about the lookbook, you're probably aware that Vermont has like this whole clean water database that just lists projects. And I'm curious whether you're just, mining those projects and including them in the lookbook. Because there's thousands that have been identified through the basin planning process in Vermont, which is pretty vigorous. So
Yeah, that's great. That hasn't been our process to date to get to get projects. I mean, it's really been like specific outreach to groups to ask them if they'd be willing to submit their projects. So I know there are these sort of master databases of projects that we could mine to get watershed-based projects, but really it's been more like just submitting a call for projects to the members of the partnership and then asking for people to reply, which has, I know we're missing lots of projects. On the other hand, it's a really nice kind of rapport we establish with partners when we go out and request that information too. So yeah, it's definitely a good point. I know there's a lot of this kind of project collection going on. But yeah, we would welcome additional projects. So we do this lookbook every year, and I put out the call around usually in February of each year. So, and again, it's like really projects of like just to demonstrate opportunity in the watershed, so they can be partially baked, fully baked. They can be at any different stages of the process. And these are land conservation, aquatic connectivity projects. They're all sorts of different trail projects. But really the idea is then I take them to DC and say, like, look at all this cool work that we can get done here. So it seems like a simple concept, but it has had really positive impacts. So it's been a good tool for us.
I have a question. Let's say we fast forward to the time where the bills are passed and these acts are in place, like in a year or three. How will it be decided which projects get the funding? Like, what's the plan for implementation? Or is that too early to say?
The idea behind this, so like if we follow the Delaware model, so Fish and Wildlife Service, after passage of the bill, would have 180 days to create this program, the Connecticut River Watershed Partnership Program, and then the money would likely flow through the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, NIFWIF, and that would be administered through a grant program. So right now, the Delaware gets around 15 million a year. And those funds are available to all sorts of applicants. A lot of nonprofit organizations can apply, and others as well. Tribes and other entities can apply for those funds. And they really fund a diversity of projects. Like you can actually go on to the Delaware website and see the slate of projects that are funded annually, but they are like a bunch of research projects and restoration and all sorts of different kinds of projects. And that's what we're kind of envisioning, is that this funding would flow through NIFWIF and then be administered. And we wrote in match waivers for like projects that are happening in underserved communities, so that they would have zero requirement for match. So we were trying to anticipate, some of the hurdles that partners might face in getting these funds and access. And we wanted also to like really make this about the, unique to our watershed. We're modeling it closely after the Delaware and Chesapeake, but recognizing our watershed is different. We have a different constellation of partners and needs. And so this is kind of an ongoing conversation too. I think this timeline gives us a chance to kind of get more feedback from all of you on like, what do you see as the benefits, needs, and opportunities in the Connecticut River watershed? What are we not funding that we could be funding? All of that input is like very helpful right now as we move forward.
Thank you. Anybody else have a question? Well, we are at the end of our hour, as I'm just looking up at the clock. So we can close it here and just again say thanks to our speakers, Jeremy, Markelle, Chris, Kathy, for lending us all of this detail and information on these bills, and wish you a lot of luck, and please stay in touch on how we can continue to support you. I will thank you to everybody who came today to listen, and for those who will listen to the recording. I will put out an email later today with a copy of the recording and some other resources that I'll collect from our speakers, and some of these details about the bills and who you can get in touch with. So want to wish everybody a great day. Happy Earth Day, Earth Month. Get out there and clean up, support your rivers, do anything you can do in your power to continue to keep our rivers clean and healthy and full of life. So we hope to see you again at our next live stream almost a month from now. Will be during World Fish Migration Day. So we'll be talking about fish. So we'll see you again soon. Thanks again for coming.
Stacy, can I add a closing remark?
Sure.
One of the goals for the Wild and Scenic on the Deerfield is that'll be a source of funding of $220,000, I think, according to Chris's presentation. It seemed like a theme throughout this presentation today was we're always looking for money. Nonprofits need fuel to be able to do all these efforts. And the goal with the Wild and Scenic is we'll have an annual fund of money to be able to do a lot of things we wanted to do on the river.
Absolutely. So I hope it doesn't take 10 or 20 years to make it happen.
Sooner the better. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Any other closing comments? Sounds good. All right. Thanks, everybody.